Folks, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something that the mainstream media does not want you to understand. They're running the headlines, they're screaming from their little blue check accounts, they're clutching their pearls on CNN and MSNBC, and they want you to be horrified. They want you to hear the words, "Trump fired nearly 100 immigration judges," and immediately feel some kind of outrage, some kind of indignation, some automatic Pavlovian response that the system is broken, and Donald Trump is the one who broke it. But here's what I want you to do today. I want you to sit down, take a breath, and actually think about what's happening here. Because when you actually look at the facts, when you actually follow the logic of what this administration is doing, it is not a scandal. It is a correction. A long, long overdue correction to a system that has been compromised from the inside for decades. Let's start at the very beginning. What is an immigration judge? Now, I know a lot of people hear the word judge and they think of the Supreme Court. They think of a lifetime appointment, a black robe, a gavel, the whole picture. Totally independent, totally untouchable. But that's not what we're talking about here at all. Immigration judges are not Article 3 judges. They are not appointed by the Senate confirmation process with the same protections. They are employees of the Department of Justice. Executive branch employees. They work for the Attorney General. They serve at the pleasure of the executive. This is not a controversial legal opinion. This is how the system was designed. This is black letter law. So when you hear people screaming that Trump is attacking the judiciary, that he's threatening the independence of the courts, just understand that the people doing the screaming either don't know what they're talking about or they are deliberately misleading you. These are DOJ employees. And when the President of the United States decides he wants different DOJ employees, that is within his constitutional authority. Full stop. Now let's talk about why this matters so much right now. Because this isn't just some abstract policy debate about the structure of the executive branch. This is about whether or not the United States of America can actually enforce its own immigration laws. And I want you to think about what this immigration court system has looked like for the last several years. At the start of 2025, there were about 700 immigration judges spread across 71 courts around the country. 700 judges. And do you know how many pending cases were sitting in that system? Nearly 4 million. 4 million cases backlogged. 4 million people who entered this country, went through some process of being caught or presenting themselves, got a notice to appear in court, and then just waited. Some of them waited 5, 6, 7 years for their day in court. And you know what happens when you're waiting in immigration court limbo for 5, 6, 7 years? You build a life. You have kids who were born here. You put down roots. And then, when the court finally gets to your case, the whole removal process becomes infinitely more complicated and infinitely more politically charged. The backlog wasn't a bug in the system. For a lot of people who wanted to keep the borders open and keep deportations low, the backlog was the feature. The backlog was the strategy. So when Donald Trump comes in and says, "We are going to clean up this system, we are going to make it work, we are going to actually enforce the laws that Congress passed," he's not attacking justice. He is trying to restore it. He is trying to build a system that can actually function. And if the people who were running that system were resistant to that mission, if they were dragging their feet, if they were using their positions to undermine the administration's lawful immigration agenda, then yes, you clean house. That's what you do. That's what every competent executive does when they inherit a bureaucracy that is not aligned with their mission. Now here's where the mainstream narrative really falls apart, and I want you to pay close attention here. The critics are saying that Trump is firing all these judges, and it's going to make the immigration system worse. It's going to make the backlogs longer. It's going to slow down deportations. And they say this as though it's somehow an argument against what Trump is doing. But think about what they're actually admitting when they say that. They're admitting that these judges were the ones who were slow-walking cases. They're admitting that the existing judiciary was the bottleneck. They're admitting that the courts as they were constituted were not processing cases efficiently. And if that's true, If a system with 700 judges still had nearly 4 million cases backed up, then clearly the problem was not a shortage of judges. The problem was how those judges were doing their jobs. Let me tell you something about who these judges were. NPR, not exactly a right-wing outlet, NPR did their own analysis. They tracked the professional backgrounds of about 70 of the fired judges. And what did they find? The largest share of fired judges had prior experience in immigrant defense. They had spent their careers representing immigrants, arguing for asylum, fighting removal orders, and then they became the judges adjudicating those exact same types of cases. Now I want you to think about that for a second. Imagine you're running a company, and you find out that the people you hired to neutrally evaluate your products used to work for your competitors and spent their entire careers arguing against products just like yours. Would you be surprised if those evaluators were not exactly neutral? Would you be surprised if they were systematically finding against you? Of course not. The immigration court system was stocked, particularly in the Biden years, with judges who came from the advocacy world, who had spent their careers trying to keep as many people in this country as possible, and then we expected them to fairly adjudicate cases where the government was seeking removal. The conflict of interest was baked in. The Trump administration looked at this and said, "Enough. We are going to bring in judges who understand that the immigration courts exist to enforce the law, not to find creative ways around it. We are going to bring in people with backgrounds in immigration enforcement, in the military, in federal service, people who understand what national security looks like, what the rule of law looks like from the other side of the desk. And the fired judges and their supporters are acting like this is some kind of outrage. But I would ask you this. Would any of those same critics object if a Democratic president replaced judges who came primarily from enforcement backgrounds with judges who came from advocacy backgrounds? You know the answer. We all know the answer. The only difference is which way the ideology runs. And speaking of the Biden administration, let's not let that slide by without comment. Because the people acting most horrified right now, the ones writing the think pieces and going on television to clutch their pearls about Trump's attack on the judiciary, these are the same people who were completely silent when Joe Biden's administration was loading up the immigration courts with judges from the advocacy community. They were silent when Biden's EOIR was essentially being stocked as a resistance institution designed to throw sand in the gears of any future enforcement effort. They didn't say a word about judicial independence then. They didn't say a word about the conflict of interest then. They only care about judicial independence when the judges in question are the ones aligned with their political goals. That's not principle. That's just politics dressed up in a robe. Now, I want to address the argument that comes up a lot in these conversations, and it's the argument about due process. The argument that by firing these judges and shrinking the courts, Trump is denying immigrants their due process rights. And I take due process seriously. I genuinely do. The rule of law matters. The right to a hearing matters. These are foundational American principles, and I am not going to stand here and tell you they don't apply to people who are in the immigration system. They do. But let's have an honest conversation about what due process in the immigration context actually means and what it requires. Due process does not mean that you get to wait 7 years for a hearing while you build an unreviewable life in the United States. Due process does not mean that the backlog itself becomes a form of de facto amnesty, where cases are so delayed that removal becomes practically impossible. Due process means that you get a fair hearing in a reasonable time before a neutral adjudicator who applies the law as written. And a system with 4 million backlogged cases is not providing that. A system where someone can cross the border illegally, get a court date for 6 years from now, and then basically disappear into the country because nobody has the capacity to follow up, the system is not serving due process. That system is a joke, and the people defending it are not defending due process. They are defending a broken process that happens to produce outcomes they prefer. Here is what the Trump administration is actually trying to build. They are trying to build a system that moves faster, a system that gets to cases in months, not years, A system where people who have valid claims can get those claims adjudicated quickly and get the protection they deserve, and people who don't have valid claims get a fair hearing and then get removed as the law requires. That is what a functional immigration court system looks like. And to build it, you need judges who are oriented toward that mission. You cannot build a fast, efficient, law enforcement-focused system with judges who spent their careers trying to slow down exactly those outcomes. It just doesn't work. No business could operate that way. No government agency could operate that way. And let me say something about the military lawyers, because this is another thing the media has been losing their minds about. The Trump administration is bringing in military lawyers, JAG officers, to serve as temporary immigration judges. And the coverage treats this like it's some kind of unprecedented authoritarian move, like the stormtroopers are taking over the courts. But think about who military lawyers actually are. They are trained legal professionals. JAG Corps officers go to law school. They pass the bar. They are experienced in courts martial, which are adversarial proceedings with rules of evidence, rights of the accused, the whole structure. Many of them have handled cases involving the Uniform Code of Military Justice that are far more complex than a standard immigration removal proceeding. These are not amateurs. These are not political hacks. These are professional lawyers with federal legal experience who are being asked to step in and fill a gap. And, frankly, someone who has spent a career in military service has probably got a better understanding of what national security actually means than someone who spent their career in immigrant advocacy. So, yes, bring in the JAG officers. I think that's a good thing. Let's talk about the geographic pattern for a minute, because this is important. The union representing immigration judges pointed out that a lot of the fired judges were in liberal areas. New York, San Francisco, Boston, and the critics act like this is damning evidence of political targeting. But I want you to think about this from a different angle. These are also the areas where the immigration courts were most politicized. These are the jurisdictions where local governments had declared themselves sanctuary cities, where local officials were openly bragging about not cooperating with federal immigration enforcement, where the political culture around immigration was most hostile to any enforcement at all. Is it really a surprise that courts embedded in that culture, in cities that celebrate resistance to immigration law, might have developed a culture that was resistant to the mission the Trump administration was trying to accomplish? Of course, you're going to see more firings there. Of course, those are the courts that most needed to be restructured. Now let me address the San Francisco court specifically, because it's become kind of a symbol in this debate. The administration announced that it's going to close the San Francisco Immigration Court. The building's lease isn't being renewed. Cases will be transferred to the Concord Court about 30 miles away. And you would think from the coverage that this is the end of civilization as we know it. But let's look at what the San Francisco court actually looked like. At the start of 2025, it had 21 judges. By early 2026, it was down to 4 judges plus a supervisor. Now you can blame the firings for some of that. But judges also retired and resigned. And if you've got a court that has gone from 21 judges down to 5, and it's trying to handle 120,000 cases, and the building's lease is coming up for renewal, and there's another court 30 miles away that can absorb those cases, then closing that location and consolidating is just basic management. It is not a purge. It is not an attack on due process. It is running the government like a business, which, by the way, is exactly what Donald Trump promised to do. The union president said that Congress authorized 800 immigration judges, and here we are, firing them. And that sounds compelling until you ask one very simple question. How is it possible that we had nearly 700 immigration judges and still had 4 million cases backlogged? If the judges we had weren't clearing the backlog, why would 800 judges of the same type do the trick? The problem was never the number of judges. The problem was the culture, the orientation, the institutional resistance to enforcement. You can have 1,000 immigration judges who are committed to slow-walking every removal case and you will still have 4 million cases backlogged. You can have 300 immigration judges who are committed to fair, fast, law-based adjudication, and you will clear that backlog in a few years. Numbers don't matter as much as mission, and this administration is aligning the mission. I want to spend a minute on the legal challenges, because they're coming. You knew they were going to come. The fired judges have filed class appeals. Some of them have filed discrimination complaints. One judge, Tanya Niemeyer, is suing in federal district court, and she's making the argument that anti-discrimination laws apply to federal employees and that she was wrongfully terminated. Now look, she can make that argument. That's her right. That's how the system works. But here's the thing. The Attorney General's authority over immigration judges is not some novel legal theory invented by this administration. It has been upheld repeatedly. The DOJ's position that the Attorney General can remove immigration judges pursuant to Article 2 authority is well established. These lawsuits may generate sympathetic press coverage. They may drag on for years. But the underlying legal foundation for what the Trump administration is doing is solid. And let's think about who we're talking about when we talk about these fired judges as sympathetic plaintiffs. These are people who, in some cases, were so committed to the immigrant advocacy cause that they were willing to fight cases all the way to the Supreme Court. These are people who, by NPR's own analysis, came overwhelmingly from the defense side of immigration law. These are not neutral arbiters who were doing their jobs impartially and got caught up in a political purge. Some of them were, effectively, political opponents of the enforcement mission sitting in positions of judicial authority. And, again, I want to be clear, I'm not saying they were doing anything illegal. I'm not saying they were all acting in bad faith. But there is a legitimate question about whether a judge who spent their entire career fighting to keep immigrants in the country can be truly neutral when they're adjudicating removal cases. That question is worth asking, and the Trump administration is acting on the answer. Here's the bigger picture that I think gets lost in all of this day-to-day coverage. What Trump is doing with the immigration courts is part of a much larger and much more coherent project. It's the same project he's executing with the FBI, with the CIA, with the State Department, with the federal workforce generally. The project is to break the stranglehold of the permanent bureaucratic class on the executive branch. The permanent bureaucracy, what some people call the deep state, but I prefer to call it the administrative state, has accumulated enormous power over decades. These are career civil servants, career DOJ employees, career agency staff who have developed their own culture, their own values, their own priorities, and who have learned how to resist and frustrate political leadership they disagree with without ever doing anything technically illegal. They slow things down, they leak, they file internal complaints. They interpret rules in the most restrictive way possible when a Republican is in charge and the most permissive way possible when a Democrat is in charge. And elected presidents who try to actually change policy run into this wall of bureaucratic resistance again and again. What Trump figured out in his first term, and what he came back in his second term absolutely committed to fixing, is that you cannot actually govern if you don't control your own executive branch. That sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Of course, the president should control the executive branch. That's literally what the Constitution says. But in practice, the administrative state had become so entrenched, so self-perpetuating, so resistant to democratic accountability, that the will of the voters as expressed through their elected president was being systematically frustrated by career bureaucrats who never had to face an election. The immigration courts were one of the clearest examples of this dynamic. And Trump is fixing it. It's messy. It generates bad headlines. Some good people are probably getting caught up in it along with the problematic ones. That's how big institutional changes work. But the direction is right. And let's talk about results for just a second, because the media doesn't want to cover the results. The backlog in immigration cases fell by over 300,000 cases between Trump's inauguration and the end of January 2026. 300,000 cases. That is not nothing. That is a massive reduction in a backlog that had been growing for years under the previous administration. Now, some of that is because fewer people are crossing the border, which is also a result of Trump's policies. But some of it is the courts actually moving faster. Some of it is judges who are oriented toward resolution rather than delay getting through cases more efficiently. The numbers are moving in the right direction. The system is actually starting to function. And you'll notice that the same outlets screaming about the firings are not giving Trump credit for the progress on the backlog, because the narrative is Trump destroys everything he touches, and facts that contradict that narrative get buried. I also want to address something that Trump himself said, because it became a huge controversy. He said, "We cannot give everyone a trial, because to do so would take 200 years. And the media went absolutely berserk. They said he was attacking due process. He was saying immigrants don't deserve hearings. He was channeling some kind of authoritarian impulse. But let's read that statement in context. He was not saying that people should be deported without any process. He was making a mathematical point about the unsustainability of a system where every single person who is apprehended at the border gets a full adversarial hearing before an immigration judge. With hundreds of thousands of apprehensions every year and a court system that already had millions of cases backlogged, the math does not work. You cannot give every single person who shows up at the border a multi-year adversarial process before a judge. The system cannot handle it. That was his point. And the solution is not to just give up on enforcement. The solution is to build a smarter, faster, more efficient system that can actually process cases at scale, which is exactly what he's trying to do. Here's what I think the honest conservative position on all of this looks like. The firings were necessary. The restructuring was necessary. The shift away from an advocacy-oriented court culture toward an enforcement-oriented one is the right call. The use of military lawyers as temporary judges is a reasonable stopgap, while a new class of permanent judges is being trained. The closure of courts in areas where cases can be consolidated is smart management. All of this is defensible. All of this is legal, and all of this is moving the immigration system in a direction that the American people voted for when they elected Donald Trump. Twice. But here's the caveat I will offer, because I try to be honest with you even when it complicates the narrative. The pace has to be managed. You can't fire 100 judges and not backfill them quickly and expect the system to function. The administration has to follow through on the hiring push. The new classes of immigration judges that are being trained every quarter, they need to be good. They need to be professional. They need to apply the law fairly, even if they're oriented toward enforcement. Because if the new judges are just going to rubber stamp everything without giving people real hearings, then the lawsuits will succeed, and the whole project will be set back. The goal is a court system that enforces immigration law efficiently and fairly. Efficient and fair are not opposites. You can have both. And if this administration gets the personnel right, if the new judges they're bringing in are solid lawyers who apply the law even when it occasionally produces results the administration doesn't like, then this restructuring will be remembered as one of the most consequential and successful policy moves of the Trump era.